Hey there, I'm Andy Larsen, Jazz beat writer for the Salt Lake Tribune, here with Jason and Kevin, the Utes and Cougars beat writers for the Salt Lake Tribune, respectively. Guys, it is rivalry week. I think this is a moment a lot of fans across the state are excited for and looking forward to. I thought we'd preview this week's game coming up at LaBelle Edwards Stadium. I want to start kind of by asking both of you guys, with BYU at 6-0, Utah at 5-1, which of these teams do we know more about, and how confident about the kind of state of your team that you cover, the Utes and Cougars, respectively, respectively, excuse me, which are you most confident about, kind of who they are as a football team midway through the year? I'll start with you, Jason.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think Utah, we've learned a little bit about them just from the Texas Tech game, especially offensively, like what happens when a team loads the box. I think the Arizona State game was pretty telling, especially when Utah is dominating the line of scrimmage. I mean, Arizona State has a pretty decent run defense, and Dampier ran all over them for 120 rushing yards, and so I think the identity of Utah's offense is pretty clear when they're able to run the ball and get in the trenches and dominate the line of scrimmage. That's what makes this football team good. And I think, if they're able to do that against BYU, I think they have a path to victory. But if it comes down to a battle between Bear and Devin passing, I'm not too confident in Utah pulling away from that game. So we'll see what happens. But I think we've learned a little bit more about Utah just from the level of opponent they faced. Even though Arizona State was without Levitt, I think we've learned a little bit more about them so far.
Yeah, we'll talk about the quarterback battle in a second. But Kevin, same question to you. I mean, obviously a tough game against Arizona, a close game against Arizona. What did you take away from that contest, and how much do you feel like you'll be able to learn watching them against the Utes coming up this week?
I think BYU's only played really one good team this year, and that was Arizona on the road. And I actually think we learned a ton from BYU in terms of their resilience. Like, yes, it was close, and yes, it had to go to double overtime, and they probably should have lost that game. And you could probably make that argument, but at the same time, like a true freshman going into Tucson and a rain delay and the offense stalling and then having to restart, I think you learned a lot about what this team can be, and actually went according to plan of what BYU wants to do. They ran LJ Martin for 150 plus yards. They ran Bear Bachmeier 20 plus times. And that is, at this point, I think the run game is the identity of what BYU's offense is, and they'll pass off of that when they have to. And then if they're forced to, I think they can throw. We've seen moments where Bear Bachmeier is able to throw. He made a critical fourth down conversion to Parker Kingston, made a very good throw to Chase Roberts right before that. So Bear Bachmeier's capable. I don't know if that's his strength necessarily right now. I think running is probably what he does best at this point. But I thought that was a good win because before that, we really haven't seen BYU play a team that you would say is going to be contending for the postseason at all. I mean, Stanford was we know what Stanford is, and then
Yeah.
the first two games of the Big 12, like they played the maybe two of the three worst teams in the Big 12 to start the conference play. So I think going on the road to Arizona was the first real data point we have for this team, but we're going to know a lot more against Utah because I think Utah should be one of the better defenses BYU faces. Arizona was a good defense. I think showed a lot the kind of the Bronco Mendenhall type of scheme that BYU knows very well because of how long Bronco Mendenhall has been involved and how many connections he has to the staff. But I do think we still are learning a little bit more about BYU as time goes on.
Because it is rivalry week. We've been talking at the office a lot about this game coming up, and kind of, I think maybe the biggest discussion point for us here is like, who is actually the better quarterback right now between Bear Bachmeier and Devin Dampier? There's been some differing opinions here. Jason, you kind of hinted at yours. Kevin, I think you disagree. I want to hear kind of from both of your perspectives. Who do you think is a better quarterback right now? Who do you think will be the better quarterback? How do you see this game kind of playing out with the quarterbacks against the two opposing defenses that they'll be facing?
Well,
Uh,
I think for me, I think Devin Dampier is probably a better, just a more finished product right now than Bear Bachmeier is. I think Bear Bachmeier will eventually be better than Devin Dampier. I think he has a lot of the traits that you look at and say that he will be good. And starting as a true freshman is very, very difficult in college football. But I do think right now, at this point, from what we've seen, Bear Bachmeier's best trait is running the ball, and that's why they do it so much, and they're very effective with it. I mean, he runs 20 plus times a game against Arizona to win that game, and they needed every single one of them. I mean, he has two touchdowns to tie the game and then win the game. So I think it's not a knock on Bear Bachmeier. I think that's just what he's most effective at, and we're going to see him develop into a passer or more polished passer in this offense. And that's just we've seen that for every quarterback at BYU. I mean, we saw Jake Retzlaff from year 1 to year 2 take a big jump. We've seen Zach Wilson and Jaron Hall make the same jump. So I think that Bear Bachmeier will eventually get there. But I think Devin Dampier has a more experience under his belt. He's had more starts, and I think he's a little bit of a better passer. Now, I think there's questions about some of his, how far can he really push the ball downfield, and is he a polished passer in terms of his deep passing attack? I don't know, and we'll see. That's a question I think I have for this week in terms of what will BYU make him do, if they can make him do that. But right now for this week, I think Devin Dampier is better, but Bear Bachmeier would be better in the future.
It's been really interesting to see how BYU went to Bear Bachmeier run games so often, so late in the fourth quarter against Arizona. And then obviously Utah's been doing that more and more recently with their game against Arizona State with Devin Dampier's success. Both of these teams are so heavily focused on quarterback run. Jason, what's your take on the two local QBs?
Yeah, I think I kind of agree with Kevin on the take that Devin right now is a better quarterback, but I think long term Bear just has more intangibles and better potential to be a guy that will continue to be a better polished passer. Obviously, the run game, for him is a big facet of his game, just like it is Devin's. But right now, if I were, a football GM or somebody that was going to draft these two guys, right now just I mean, based off of pure talent, I would take Devin. I think Devin's just best trait is running the football, especially when he's healthy. I think his ankle's back to full health, and we saw what he did against Arizona State. And I think that trait alone separates Devin from Bear, just because he's so good at running the football. I mean, he had 1,000 yards rushing last year. He's one of the 5 quarterbacks all time, I think, in college football to run for 1,000 yards and pass for 2,500, and the 4 other guys in those are Heisman contenders or Heisman winners. And so, I think when you look at Dev as a passer, though, I think that's when it kind of gets concerning. And we saw it. Obviously, he did have a bum ankle in that game. Kyle said that some players wouldn't even play that game, but we saw what happened when Texas Tech loaded the box, and that Utah wasn't winning in the trenches. Dev was turned into a passer, and he wasn't as consistent as he usually is in the run game. And so, as a passer, I think I might take Bear right now. But I know that's kind of a weird way to take it. But I think overall I'd take Devin, but long term I'd take Bear just because I like his ability as a passer more.
I want to get to the cultural aspect of this game because it is kind of what everyone is kind of thinking about talking about. But before we get there, let's do one last kind of topic on the game itself, and that is who is going to win this game. What are the kind of what are going to be the keys to this game that end up making the difference come Saturday? We're all headed down there to watch the game and analyze it, understand it. I'll start with you, Jason. What do you think is kind of one key for Utah that may determine whether or not they win or lose this game?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to Devin. I think this offense lives and breathes and dies through Devin Dampier. If Devin's running the ball well, I think Utah wins. If BYU can corral him in the backfield and force him to be a passer, I think BYU wins. And so I think that's the biggest key heading into this game is what is Utah's offense going to look like against a pretty good BYU defense. Especially, in the trenches. BYU has really good linebackers in Jack Kelly. And so, I think that's an avenue. Can Utah win up front defensively? Utah's defensive line has been pretty good this year. John Henry Daly leads the Big 12 in sacks, if I'm not mistaken, still. And so, that's a big facet for Utah. But another thing, can Utah corral LJ Martin? I mean, last week, we saw Utah, they cleaned up a lot of their tackling miscues, but that's been a problem for them, extending back to even last year. And if they can't corral LJ Martin, they might have problems defensively. And so we'll see how it goes. But I think the two biggest keys are tackling. What will Devin do? Those would be my two keys to kind of see how the game goes.
How about you, Kevin? What about from the BYU perspective?
Honestly, I agree with a lot of that. Just on the inverse of it, I think if BYU is going to be effective in this game, they're going to have to establish the run of some kind. And I think it's going to have to come from LJ Martin because I don't know if you can. I mean, a lot of those 22 carries from Bear, 14 of them, I think, came in the fourth quarter in terms of the overtime. So I don't know if you can just run Bear 40 times if you're just going to do it the whole game, right? Like, I think you're going to need something. And LJ Martin's shown that. I mean, he was good in the game last year, even playing a little bit unhealthy. And I think BYU should be able to run the ball at least a little bit with LJ Martin and then just kind of help out this offense because I do think everything kind of revolves around LJ Martin. And then the other part is, which would be very big for BYU, not just in this game, but going forward, is if they can find somebody else outside of LJ Martin to kind of carry that load that's not Bear Bachmeier. If it, they've obviously had a lot of injuries, but if you can get Preston Rex a little bit more involved in the passing game out of the backfield, which we've seen a little bit, just not a lot, that could open up a lot more for guys like Parker Kingston and Chase Roberts, and just get Bear some easy looks and some easy completions against a Morgan Scalley defense, which we know historically is going to be ready for this game. And I mean, look at last year. BYU was a better team last year. They were more talented last year. And Morgan Scalley made that game very, very difficult for Jake Retzlaff, who had more experience than Bear Bachmeier. So I think that's going to be key.
Right.
And then the other part I think on defense is if you can force Devin Dampier to throw the football and make him a little bit more one-dimensional, and particularly take away some of these quick passing, some of the quick passing game that he's more comfortable. I mean, he has a 71% completion rating for a reason, and it's because he's efficient and he gets the ball out. And if they can just force him to not have as clean of looks, I mean, Texas Tech, yeah, he was a little bit banged up, but I thought that's what some things that Texas Tech did really well is they took away the run, they took away he was inefficient in the quick passing game, and I think if BYU can do that, the blueprint is there. And I don't know if BYU's defense is necessarily better than Texas Tech's, but I think it's up there. I think they're comparable, and I think they've done it. So I think if they can do those things, I think it's a winnable game for BYU, particularly at home.
I'll throw in one of my own. I mean, I think Smith Snowden did a great job against Jordan Tyson in the Arizona State game, and kind of it's been a banged up secondary for the U. Kind of outside of that, though, and especially at the safeties position, I'm curious to see kind of how and if Chase Roberts, Parker Kingston, et cetera, can get open against the Utah secondary, or if instead, they do have the level of success that they did against Arizona State. I think kind of in the middle and deep parts of the field is one place where BYU could win this game, or Utah could get more than we expect.
Especially, I mean, if they can get more from the special teams too, like I think special teams is key, because last year we even saw BYU's offense was struggling, and then they have a kick return for a touchdown from Keelan Marion. Like these are things that BYU, like I think oftentimes I think we think of there's kind of ancillary to what they're doing, but I think it's very pivotal if they're consistently trying to drive 95 yards and have go against Smithstone 15 play drives. Like I don't think that works for BYU. So if they can get better field position, if they can get Parker Kingston maybe to get a free 6 points, it worked last year.
Yeah, I think another. Oh, sorry. I think another key kind of thinking about it is I go back to Utah's wide receivers. I mean, you're talking about Parker Kingston, Chase Roberts. I look at Utah and I think they only have one guy that I think is an actual threat in this offense, which is Brian Davis, and he's been their number one guy, which is something I don't think anybody expected heading into this game. So if Utah's in a position where Devin's not able to run, Wayshawn Parker, Nakari Rogers, all those guys aren't getting their yards per carry that they usually do. Can Tobias Merriweather, can Larry Simmons, can all those guys make an impact outside of the tight ends? And that's something I don't know if Utah can do because they haven't done it consistently. I mean, I was surprised last week that Tobias Merriweather actually caught a ball from Devin Dampier. So it seems like every time he throws a ball to him, it's either Arid or Tobias is running a different route, or the connection between those two has just been off all season. And so if it comes down to a passing battle between Bear, I mean Bear obviously he's not as polished as a freshman, but he has guys to throw to. And I'm not saying Devin doesn't, but the consistency there is not the same as it is for BYU. So I think that's another interesting facet of the game for sure.
And as much as all of that is what will actually determine who wins on the football field, I think more fans on the internet and maybe more fans around the water coolers of Utah are talking about the coaches, the cultural divide, the holy war, all of those kind of things, right, that make this into an interesting rivalry. Both coaches had their Monday press conferences this week. I don't think that there was anything that was bulletin board material said in those, but I think they did reflect kind of that this is a big game for both teams, and said kind of interesting things that kind of reflect how they want to have their teams in kind of a certain mindset going into this game. Let's start with you, Kevin, in terms of kind of what Kalani Sitake said. It's how is that his team approaching this game, and what do you think was interesting about what was said on Monday?
Well, I think the one thing I really appreciate about Kalani is I think when it is a big moment for his program, I don't think he necessarily shies away from the fact that it is a big moment where, I think a lot of people try to downplay it. And, obviously there's different approaches to it, but I think he acknowledges how big and important this game is for BYU in terms of just their in-state recruiting, but also just the momentum of the program. And you look at this game 2 years ago. I know Utah hasn't won this game since 2019. Part of that is because they haven't played every single year. But you just look at how different this in-state rivalry was, I think, from 2023 when they didn't play until now. I mean, 2023 BYU's coming in, and there's questions about can they compete in the Big 12? Like that was their first year. They lose 7 games. They miss a bowl game, and I know they didn't play Utah that year, but there was players transferring out of BYU to go to Utah, and like yes, that happens every year. But John Henry Daly, like you look at the Fano brothers, like there was, if you looked at this kind of the state of football in Utah, you would have said Utah has every single advantage right now. There's an established program, the Power Five, and BYU is trying to find their way, and who knows? And now 2 years later, Kalani Sitake has a contract extension. He's coming off an 11-2 year. They're recruiting at the best pace they've ever done. They've gotten in-state recruits. Like I look at Falatau Satawala, who's a key pivotal playmaker on this team, right? Like he was a Utah commit, comes in from Jay Hill, and Jay Hill kind of flips him from Utah. And then you kind of look around, like I think Brock Harris is another example of it, as a in-state kid who commits to BYU instead of Utah. And so there's just a lot of momentum. And I think days like this are really, really pivotal for BYU because it just continues that. You don't really want to relinquish that when you have it. I don't think this game means everything for it. There's resources, there's plenty other things that go into it. But I think Kalani Sitake knows how important this game is to continue that momentum. And also, I think there's a lot on the line. I don't think he's talked about it particularly, but winning 3 straight in these games, like I think that's quite important. And I think it shows a shift in power and where this state is at. If that happens, and if not, like we talk about it, and on Monday we're talking about a completely different thing. But I do think that's generally what the takeaway is on a Monday.
Yeah, Jason, what about you with Kyle Whittingham and the Utes?
Yeah, Kyle had a much different approach than Kalani did on Monday. He was asked a question about Bear Bachmeier and how good of a quarterback is he, all that. And Kyle said, I'm not talking about him this week. I'm only talking about our guys. And so, it's kind of been the same mentality, like very carefully spoken, Utah players, very carefully spoken Mark Atuaya last night. Like they're treating it as just another game, per se. I mean, that's kind of been the narrative that they've been spewing this week, and obviously, I think that's pretty coordinated. So it's an interesting, different approach from Utah this week. I think last year heading into the game, there was just so much on Utah's side. Obviously, Mark Harlan walks out to the field, the podium incident where he says, I was a proud member I was proud of being in the Big 12, but now I'm not. Jalen Glover says FBYU before the game, and so there was a lot of noise coming from Utah last year, and I think that's kind of not necessarily the case. But in a sense, this feels like a get back game for Kyle Whittingham, especially if this is his last season. And I think that is important for Kyle as much as they don't want to act like it is. I think if Kyle's last year, he wants to have that BYU win. Obviously making the playoff is on his list, or winning a Big 12 championship, but I think in there is beating BYU, and he lost the last 2 games. And I'm not saying Kyle Whittingham's a prideful person, but he doesn't like this team down south, as he refers to it. And so I think there's a lot of pride, but I think this goes back to how Utah has treated this rivalry. They've wanted to downplay it. They want to downplay the importance. I mean, it goes back to when Utah scheduled Michigan over the BYU game, and Chris Hill came out and said, fans want to see Michigan more than they do BYU. And so there's been this perpetual, thing from Utah where it's almost like this game isn't as important to them as it is for BYU. And I don't necessarily think that's the case anymore. I think Utah has to win this game because, like Kevin mentioned, in-state recruiting matters. That, the pendulum of just who's the top program in Utah, who's going to be, the guys getting, all the top recruits, the transfer portal, all those things. This, it's not the ultimate deciding factor, but it is a big factor in that. And you're going to have recruits that are deciding between Utah and BYU in the next few years down the line, going to these types of games. And so I think it's an interesting approach from Utah, but obviously it is an important game. And I just think the mentality of downplaying it has always been a thing that Utah likes to do, even dating back when they were in the Pac-12. So
yeah, well, and it's hard to downplay this one because even if you only care about this season and whatever, it matters for the Big 12 standings in a big and in a major way in terms of who gets to that championship game, who may make the playoffs, and so on and so forth. Guys, thank you so much for talking about this game with me. I'm looking forward to covering it with you on Saturday. Please make sure to you out there listening to watch our coverage at sltrib.com, looking for all sorts of fun coverage we've got coming before and, of course, after this game. It's going to be a good one. Thanks again for listening.